Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. Ethiopia is on the brink of a potentially devastating civil war. On November 4th, the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed launched military operations against the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF, which is the group that controls the Tigray region in northern Ethiopia. The TPLF was the dominant political party in the coalition that ruled Ethiopia for decades. It was through this coalition, known as the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Front, that the TPLF leader Meles Zenawi ruled Ethiopia for 27 years until his death in 2012. Tensions have been simmering now for some time between the federal government, which Abiy controls, and the TPLF. After Abiy came to power in 2018, he dissolved that ruling coalition, and eventually the TPLF lost the influence they once held. Meanwhile, Abiy enacted a series of democratic reforms and also entered into a peace agreement with Ethiopia's longtime foe, Eritrea. And it was for this peacemaking act that Abiy was conferred the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019. Now, just 1 year later, Abiy has launched a military campaign that could very well spark a widespread civil war. On the line with me to discuss recent events in Ethiopia and offer some analysis of why the country is on the brink of civil war is Mastewal Terefe. She is an Ethiopian policy analyst and lawyer based in New York who formerly served as a fellow at the Ethiopian Attorney General's office, supporting legal and justice reform efforts. We kick off discussing the events of November 4 before having a broader conversation about the causes of escalating tensions between Abiy and the TPLF. As you will see in this conversation, there is a great risk right now that this conflict between the federal government and the TPLF spreads to other armed groups that are organized along ethnic lines. The risk for a calamitous civil war is very high, and just to put this into context, Ethiopia has about 5 times the population of Syria. A sectarian civil war would be a massive humanitarian crisis for the Ethiopian people and an immense threat to international peace and security. Today's episode, I think, serves as both a good explanation of what is happening and also a dire warning that unless the sides de-escalate, this crisis could spiral out of control. So I just have one announcement today. Speaking of peace, this December 7th to 9th, join a global group of doers in taking on the planet's biggest challenges and shaping what comes next. PeaceCon is a unique global gathering of peace builders, policymakers, activists, and philanthropists hosted by the Alliance for Peacebuilding. PeaceCon 2020 will convene participants to address the shifting world order and how best to take on global fragility, violent extremism, systemic racism, exclusion, and climate disruption, among other issues. PeaceCon will also consider strategies to elevate and integrate peacebuilding in a collective effort to shape a more just, secure, and peaceful future in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic. Confirmed speakers include the McCain Institute's Ambassador Mark Green, Ford Foundation President Darren Walker, Time's Up CEO Tina Chen, Dr. John Paul Lederach, Congresswoman Grace Meng, and many more. Visit allianceforpeacebuilding.org/PeaceCon-2020 to learn more about PeaceCon 2020, taking place virtually from December 7 to 9. Register today. And today's episode is produced in part with support from the Carnegie Corporation of New York for a series of episodes featuring African expertise on peace and security issues in Africa. You can listen to other episodes in this series by going to globaldispatchespodcast.com. All right, now here is my conversation with Mastewal Terefe.
Yeah, it's still an evolving situation, like you said. But November 4 is when the federal government, the Prime Minister Abiy, announced that he has ordered a military operation, a military offensive against the Tigray regional state. So the Tigray regional state is one of the federal regional states that we have in the Ethiopian federal system, and it has been, going through this confrontation with the federal government as a result of issues that we'll probably discuss. But the regional government's decision to hold an election that the federal government doesn't recognize. So this confrontation has been building up for months, but November 4th, officially the government decided that it would intervene militarily with the objective of basically taking out of Tigray the leadership of that regional government. They are part of a party called the Tigray People's Liberation Front. So this is an offensive that the government describes as a very calculated move to take them out and then put a federal government appointed government for Tigray.
Is there anything that sparked this decision by Prime Minister Abiy to make this sudden move?
Mm-hmm. So there are many explanations, I guess, that many analysts would give on why that specific day, but the federal government's account, is that the day before, or on November 4th, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the regional government I described, attacked a northern part of the Ethiopian Defense Forces, the Northern Command, it's called, and the federal government claims that the Tigrayan party regional government attacked that military base, killed many federal defense forces, and took possession of weapons and military equipment there. So that's the federal government's explanation, whereas the regional government rejects that argument and says this war has been building up and they were preparing themselves to defend the regional government, which they deem to be to have a constitutional right of self-governance and administration. So the account from the Tigrayan side is different. But the government's explanation is that it's a response to an attack on the federal defense forces, and it sees it as a necessary measure.
So we're speaking on November 11th. What do we know about what's happening right now in Tigray? I mean, my understanding is first that like all internet and communication is basically being shut out. I follow humanitarian issues very closely, and I'm hearing grumblings from the UN and humanitarian community that they just don't have comms and communication to be able to conduct their operations. But I mean, what do you know about the fighting that's happening right now?
So what we know is that you're right, the communication lines have been interrupted since the beginning of the offensive. That includes the internet, phone phone lines, and also any type of basically banking and other financial transactions. They have been stopped with the objective, the government says, of stopping the regional government from building up its capacity to retaliate. That's what's happening. In terms of humanitarian crisis, we already today are seeing 8,000 or more of Tigrayan or Ethiopians in Tigray fleeing to Sudan. Humanitarian groups are saying this is just the beginning of a very large-scale humanitarian consequence of this potentially protracted war, and it's going to be also a huge obstacle for neighboring countries, including Sudan and Eritrea. So that's sort of what's happening now. I mean, the federal government says that this will be quick and everything will go back to normal soon. But most people watching the situation know that it's going to be hard because both sides are heavily armed, and the Tigrayan TPLF, the Tigrayan party, understands that this is a sort of an existential crisis for what it deems to be its right to exist in the federation.
And it's probably worth emphasizing something you just said, which is that these armies are not like small militias. You have like the Ethiopian Federal Army, and the Tigray army is not some tiny militia. It's like a well armed group, and it has its own sort of military and history and traditions.
Exactly. I think that's why this crisis is probably very consequential for the Ethiopian politics and the Horn of Africa, because unlike other regional states in Ethiopia, the Tigrayan region and the party has had history of resistance and rebellion, rebel movement that led to actually the kind of ethnic federalist state that we have right now. So they've had decades of experience fighting against the military regime before, and also have massive military capacity, which is obviously part of this federal defense machine that Ethiopia has, but it's stationed in Tigray, the Northern Command, and they say they have basically control over that command, over the government, although the government says that's not true.
So I'd love to learn from you your analysis and your explanation for listeners about how we got to this point. Prime Minister Abiy came to power in like 2018.
That's right.
Promising reforms and implementing a number of rather sweeping democratic reforms, liberalizing society, entering into normalization of relations with Ethiopia, for which he was conferred the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019. So you have this leader who held such great promise, yet now seems to be taking his country into a civil war. Like, what happened? How did we get to this point?
So, like you said, Mark, so the reforms in 2018 were really, thought of as a, historic and transformational, historic opportunity for Ethiopia to reinvent itself and really get its politics back on track. For 27 plus years, we had almost a one-party dictatorship throughout the 3 decades. We had mostly TPLF led, but a coalition of other parties leading Ethiopia with an iron fist. Opposition parties were exiled. We had activists in jail for being active on social media and criticizing the government for its problems. So in 2018, when the Abiy government Abiy actually got appointed by his party to lead Ethiopia, it was in the background of a massive popular movement, mainly led by the Oromo, who are one of the major forces of this political revolution. They have been protesting against government dictatorship, but also various historical grievances that they have against the Ethiopian government and the state. And they were basically, I think, around the end of 2017, added to their grievances and the protests that they were consistently putting was the Amhara, another prominent ethnic group in terms of size in Ethiopia. So they effectively forced the government, which Abiy was a part of also at the time, to accept that the popular demands cannot be prolonged or pushed for so long. And they decided that they would reinvent the ruling party, which is the Ethiopian People's Democratic Front, the EPRDF. And they said they would help basically the country transition into a democracy, a multi-party democracy. For 2 years, Abiy was going to lead that party and the country towards a free and fair election that would result in multi-party democracy. What happened since then is, as you said, Abiy did implement a lot of political and economic reforms. He put together a team of intellectuals and activists and human rights advocates to revamp some of the most draconian laws, including the anti-terrorism proclamation, all these media laws that had been used and weaponized to crack down dissent. He also invited all opposition parties to come back to Ethiopia and do what they wished to do to prepare for elections. But midway into that process, before even the COVID situation or the pandemic hit, there were questions about whether or not Ethiopia will be able to hold the next election that was scheduled for August 2020. And we saw that opposition parties had different opinions on it, whether it should be postponed or whether it's the right time to hold it. And then the pandemic hit, and the opposition would say, had a great opportunity to use this excuse to postpone the election. So that's what happened. The election got postponed. And my analysis is that that's the major sort of turning point for where we are right now.
Is it fair to say, though, that, as you noted, Abiy comes to power with a new base of political support, the Oromo, he is Oromo, which upset the political balance that had, though authoritarian, had kind of kept the peace, so to speak, in Ethiopia for 27 years, which was a political balance in which the Tigray People's Liberation Front was the key player in this coalition called the EPRDF, right? So the key players like Meles Zenawi, the longtime ruler of Ethiopia, was from the TPLF, the Tigray party, as part of this broader coalition. So really we're talking about like coalition politics, and the TPLF sort of increasingly felt sidelined as Abiy came to power. Is that like a fair interpretation?
That's a fair interpretation. So this party that you were mentioning, the EPRDF, was mainly a coalition of four parties. But there are other parties also that are not formally part of the coalition, but we're working with them. But as you say, the TPLF was deemed to have enormous influence over the others. And a lot of people would say that the type of relationship that the TPLF had with the Oromos and the Amharas and other, ethnic groups was completely disproportional in terms of the TPLF being a minority ethnic group or representing a minority ethnic group compared to the Oromos and the Amharas, which combined form a large majority of Ethiopians. So there was a lot of this, dissent and commitment to basically undo that type of what people would say disproportionate power. But what happened since Abiy came to power is, first, actually, TPLF and Tigrayans as a people were very receptive of Prime Minister Abiy. He had almost unanimous support by the country. I mean, everywhere you went in the summer of 2018, he was deemed to be basically the hope of the nation.
Mm-hmm.
But then,
and he's young, right? He's young and he's kind of charismatic. There's like a reason people sort of pinned their hopes on him.
Exactly. And he also changed the relationship that people had with government in Ethiopia. He was, he appeared to be humble and open to engaging. And he had a very big social media personality as well, with a lot of, pictures and PR, going around him as a personality. He created that type of relationship with the people. But I think what happened after that, when the government, Abiy's government, decided to execute a few arrest warrants, so some high-profile TPLF leaders they seemed that they were being targeted. So there's this party that led Ethiopia for 27 years together as a coalition, the front, and then the TPLF started saying that they're being targeted in terms of prosecutions for past corruption and other political problems that were created. And in addition to that, I would say that the fallout between Abiy and the TPLF kind of started to become a fallout between. So in other words, I would say the government started doing these popular messaging around TPLF that also started targeting the Tigrayan people as a whole. And so these documentaries were being aired by the federal government that kind of attacked the Tigrayan speakers as a collective. And so a lot of grievances built up around that. And there started, a clear shift on the TPLF side of not wanting to sort of collaborate with Abiy's agenda for reform. Then Abiy decided to create a new party, dissolve the front that sustained for about 30 years, and create his own party, which is now called the Prosperity Party. He calls it the next step, basically, for the ruling party. But TPLF did not believe in sort of the shift ideologically or otherwise, and decided that it would not join that party. That's a major break between the federal government and the TPLF.
To what extent did Abiy's decision to normalize relations with Eritrea, and we should remind listeners that Ethiopia and Eritrea, 20 years ago fought this horrible war and never had normal relations until Abiy, came to power. To what extent did that drive to normalize relations alienate the TPLF, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Party?
That's a big part of the story, actually, the story of, the conflict that we're talking about, the military confrontation. Because, as you say, the Eritrean government and the Eritrean ruling party, if we call it that, although it's the leader who's really single-handedly administering Eritrea, had been a friend of the TPLF at some point and then turned foe of the TPLF. And there's a really deeply rooted, vengeance that some people perceive that he has against the party, and the TPLF also has against him as a person, Isaias Afwerki. So when the Nobel Peace Prize and the sort of peacemaking happened, TPLF was not directly involved in it. It's the prime minister who basically single-handedly went to Asmara and started this open up process. So what the TPLF first did was actually admire the resolution of that diplomatic intervention by Abiy, and they actually publicly also supported it and went to the length of saying, this is a miracle. We could not have done it after, fighting a war that killed tens of thousands. And then you saw that kind of enthusiasm fade away when the TPLF and Abiy's relationship also deteriorated. And then TPLF started basically saying that the peace is not on the ground, and they feel sort of cornered and targeted now between Abiy in the south and then their north, the neighbor Eritrea.
And I bring up Eritrea because there is fears that should this war can escalate, it will drag in Eritrea, and this will become, a more internationalized conflict.
That's right. And in fact, actually, TPLF today and yesterday is saying exactly that there are Eritrean militia fighting already in parts of Tigray on the border. And that this had been a war orchestrated by Isaias in collaboration with Prime Minister Abiy. This is their one of the major sort of statements that they make, and that this is why they think this war is not a war between sort of domestic forces.
They think they're getting ganged up on by Eritrea and Ethiopian federal forces. So what right now is driving the logic of escalation on both sides of this conflict?
I would say two main things. So the federal government says that this is a law enforcement operation, that the TPLF is a criminal gang. They call them, a criminal junta that should be eliminated, and that any, peace dialogue or ceasefire is going to be conditioned on TPLF surrendering completely its top leadership, and also the destruction of the military capabilities that they have now in Tigray, which most people would think or would say is not acceptable, or is not even a condition that the TPLF would consider. The TPLF says that this is, like I said earlier, an attack by a foreign adversary in collaboration with someone they think is an elected dictator in the making. That's what they call the prime minister. And they think that this war could have been prevented through a very comprehensive national dialogue about the future of Ethiopia, especially in light of the postponement of the elections. So I said earlier, during the pandemic, at the beginning of it, there was this legal process that Abiy tried to follow to postpone the elections indefinitely. TPLF did not accept that process. Not just TPLF, many opposition parties rejected that process as being illegitimate. Many of the opposition parties who rejected that and called for a national dialogue and confronted Prime Minister Abiy very strongly the leaders of those parties are actually in jail right now. So it's not just TPLF that really dissented on the election issue, but TPLF had arms, and TPLF is a very prominent military power also in and of itself. That's why they're in war. So I guess like the main thing again is that the federal government does not want to concede in this question of leaving any room for TPLF to continue to govern Tigray.
And, how concerned are you that, the fighting, the civil war may spread, that other groups who feel perhaps marginalized, as you just referenced, would also want to somehow mount resistance against the federal government, or the federal government might want to take action against them? I mean, is there a risk of this conflict escalating beyond Tigray?
Yes, there's a huge risk of that, and there's already signs of it. So, like I mentioned earlier, the Oromo ethnic group, which is the base of the prime minister, or I could say that used to be the base, because he still has supporters in Oromia, but not as great as the opposition, I would say, is that Oromia right now, the vast region of Oromia, is part of that region is under a command post type of situation where communication lines are already down in Western Oromia. A lot of ethnic-based attacks are happening in Oromia. So it's already been a very volatile situation in Oromia and other parts of southern parts of the country. So when this war is going to require for the federal government to focus on the north and the Tigrayan situation, there's going to be massive instability in parts of Oromia, and we're already seeing accounts of that in the past few days. So this really is not just a Tigray problem. Oromia, especially, a lot of people have been dying on a daily basis, both Oromos and ethnic minorities in Oromia, because of liberation movements also in that part of the country. So, and this is not to mention all these other ethnic groups that have had grievances and are struggling to come up with a way of expressing those sort of demands in this political system.
So basically, this fighting between the federal government and Tigray could spark or inspire other groups like the Oromo Liberation Front to also, take up arms and mount some sort of insurrection, or also inspire the government to crack down against them. And that could have a ripple effect to other ethnic groups as well. And it's sort of worth emphasizing that Ethiopia is a very large country with a very diverse population.
That's exactly right. And it's already happening with the Oromo Liberation Front. They've been fighting for 2 years now since they returned to Ethiopia, and other ethnic groups also, but not as armed as the Tigrayans and the Oromos.
So what can be done to de-escalate the situation right now? How do you get off that ladder of escalation and break that logic of escalation that you described earlier?
Yeah, so I would say, many international humanitarian groups and also governments and politicians all over the world are calling for a ceasefire. What that would mean is obviously a stop to the airstrikes, because the military operation mainly now is from the federal government, attacking the military bases in Tigray, trying to disarm TPLF. So a ceasefire would require a stop of these operations, and then opening communication lines and humanitarian access for the people who are already, struggling in Tigray. But beyond that, a lot of people are also requiring a kind of a zoom out, requiring us to zoom out of the process and say this is a national problem that requires a national, very deliberative process of arriving at a roadmap for the country, for a new election and for a resolution to a very polarized political space in Ethiopia. So a national reconciliation process, like many countries have gone through, maybe some less successfully, but something like that, I would say, is the root, the solution that would solve the root problems in Ethiopia.
You have seen leaders from the international community call for restraint. You do worry that the U.S., which is typically a big player in Ethiopia, long sort of history of bilateral support for Ethiopia with what's going on here, there's just not much focus on what's happening there at the precipice of this awful civil war. Are there any events or inflection points in the days or weeks or months ahead that will suggest to you one way or another how this situation might unfold?
Yes, I think one thing that people were watching for is the intervention of Eritrea. So already TPLF is saying Eritrea has joined the war. That would really change the dynamics of the war and make it sort of a regional confrontation. So that's one thing. So whether or not that has happened is being debated now in Ethiopian public society. But I think that's one thing, and what Sudan and other countries which are pushing Prime Minister Abiy to sit down for dialogue actually do, because they've been doing that consistently, diplomats, in the past week. But what will be that point for them to say we're going to exert sort of more pressure on the Prime Minister to accept a ceasefire and sit down for discussions with the TPLF? So that's one thing I would say. But I think the other dimension that I haven't talked about is the confrontation between Tigray and Amhara, which is another ethnic group, a prominent ethnic group in terms of size of population that shares a border with Tigray and has had grievances, historical now, and also questions of territorial dispute around Tigray and Amhara. So there are militias in Amhara regional state which are being prepared, and some would say already fighting to claim some of the land that they think belongs to them in the Tigrayan regional state. So if that war actually turns into a serious confrontation between the Tigrayan militia and the Amhara militia, that will really be a serious risk to containing this war. So even if a ceasefire is achieved between the federal government and Tigray, there is a risk of that civil war essentially between the Amhara and Tigrayan militia. So that's another risk that many people are watching out for now.
I mean, what you're describing sounds like we have a very narrow opportunity in window right now to de-escalate the situation before it potentially spirals out of control into a situation where you have a number of various ethnic militias fighting each other. Presumably, the risk of ethnic-based violence is extremely high. And it's just such a volatile situation right now.
It's extremely volatile. And the ethnic-based attacks have been going on for almost 3 years now since the Abiy administration took over. It's pretty disheartening, actually. On almost a weekly basis, you would hear reports of ethnic-based attacks, some summary executions of people after being called for meetings and all that. So you would hear now in Ethiopia almost 3 ethnic groups crying that genocide is about to happen to them, including the Amhara, who've been targeted in parts of Oromia. And now we are hearing the Tigrayans, because of this war, that they're being ethnically profiled in Addis Ababa and other parts of the country. And the Oromos have been sort of subject to extrajudicial killings by the government, which rights groups have pointed out since 2018, since the OLF started sort of reorganizing itself in Oromia. So yeah, it's a pretty incredible mix of combustible situations that Ethiopia is going on, and I think it's important to understand that complexity when we think of Tigray as the flashing point right now. That it's really the country that needs to find a solution for its how to balance its diversity in a way that is not going to lead to a civil war.
I've been to Ethiopia a couple of times. I love the place, and you're just describing to me this nightmare scenario, and I'm just extremely nervous right now, basically, as I'm sure you are.
Yeah, it's really scary what's going on.
Well, thank you so much, though, for your time and for just helping me and listeners sort of understand what's happening right now. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark. It was lovely talking to you.
All right. Thank you all for listening. Thank you to Mastewal. That was very helpful, very sobering, but I'm glad to be able to shine a spotlight on this issue with this podcast. And yeah, these next few days and weeks seem to be very pivotal in the potential future of this crisis and the future of Ethiopia and the entire region. All right, we'll see you next time. And just a disclaimer, the views expressed in this episode solely belong to those who expressed them. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.